What if parasites could think? Part 1, Speculative Dinosaur Story. Whales can have giant parasitic worms inside them because whales are so big. Some dinosaurs are so large that they may also have had absolutely giant parasitic worms inside them. Imagine you were that big, top of the worms, the worm king. You'd feel like you were entitled to do whatever you want. That's how the worm would justify infecting the dinosaur. If you were the worm, at the very least, you'd feel powerful and have a big ego. Power corrupts. The worm was now angry at the thought of stopping being a parasite. They would think it was other animals' own fault for getting infected. If other animals were on the same level as I, the great worm king, they wouldn't succumb to getting infected. Why should I, the worm king, lower myself to other animals' pitiful level? Eventually, even the worm king would grow old and die. In their old age, they would realize their own vulnerability. They had realized that even they weren't invincible. They felt sad, empty and hollow. Would parasitic worm culture ever change? Was the worm just a product of its time? Was worm society to blame? Part 2, a true story about my pet amphibian and plants in real life. This is Loki, my pet fire salamander. I found a nematode worm in their eye. I drew the salamander and worm. The salamander's eye turned from black to blue. The operation to remove the nematode worm would have cost thousands of pounds, but they offered to do it for free, and the worm was apparently a brand new species. So here's a fern infected with a nematode worm. Nematode worms can be parasites of humans and animals. Other nematode worms, however, can be plant parasites. This reminds me of the vampires in Twilight, who only drink animal blood instead of human blood out of morality. These worms seem nice and have morals, and like they care about their impact on other creatures. In reality, the worm infects plants just because that's what they've evolved to do. One human eats hundreds of animals throughout their lifetime, but parasitic worms have a lot less hosts. Maybe that's how the worms justify it. What's worse, causing quick suffering to hundreds or causing prolonged suffering to a few? What if worms could think? The operation was a success. The worm was removed. The worm lay on their deathbed. They looked back on all their life and could finally see all the pain they caused. They reflected on it and felt guilty and awful. They thought, was it all worth it? They felt inadequate, like a failure. The worm wanted to do one good thing before they died, so that their life hadn't been all terrible. They donated their body to science, and a research paper was going to be written about this new species of worm. The worm felt at peace. Salamanders are amphibians and can dislike being handled, especially with humans' oily skin. Loki had been through the ordeal of their operation. They would feel fear, shocked, and confused as to what was happening. How do you console someone who can't be touched? Loki survived for another year and a half, but then went off their food. I may have tried hard to feed Loki, but I became mentally ill. I feel I should have tried harder. I feel guilty, awful, or inadequate from the prolonged suffering. I feel like the worm. Now I only keep pet rocks because rocks can't feel suffering. I coloured in the rock to look like the salamander. The same story takes place in the real world with the real version of my pet rock, and in the parallel universe with the parallel version of my pet rock. I coloured in the parallel version of my pet rock to look like my pet salamander as well. In the real world, though, I did actually find a nematode worm in my pet fire salamander's eye. With autism, you can notice small details like a tiny worm and see things other people can't. My family did not believe there was a worm in my pet's eye. For a while, the vet did not believe it either. Eventually, the vet saw the worm and the salamander had an operation to remove the worm. Apparently, the nematode worm was actually a new species unknown to science. I'm not making this up, this is in real life. But I did not hear back from the vets, even though a paper was apparently being written about the worm. Part 3, if wasps could think. A parasitic wasp laid its eggs inside an insect. You could see the wasp larvae through the insect's skin. I copied off a real-life photo. The wasp spoke. My children come before anything else. As parents, we have a moral obligation to treat our children better than random strangers like the hosts we infect. I didn't have much as a child. I don't want my child to worry where the next meal is coming from. Living inside a host, they have constant access to food. I want my kids to feel secure. You only get one childhood. I want them to have a happy, carefree childhood. I'm not doing this out of a selfish desire to help myself. I'm doing this for my kids. This is an act of love. I feel hurt that you would think otherwise. Humans eating insects is better for the environment than eating animals like cows. I care deeply about the environment, and that's why I infect animals like insects. I don't infect large mammals like some parasites do. I have principles. Hating animals like insects is deemed a lot more moral than hating mammals or humans. Humans kill and eat animals too. The only reason you don't think that's as bad is because you've ate so many animals that you're overexposed to eating animals. Oxytocin, the very hormone that helps human parents love their child, also makes human parents aggressive when they feel their child is threatened. You may think of parasitic wasps as aggressive, but love and aggression are two sides of the same coin. One day I found another parasitic wasp whose offspring ate my babies. A parasitic wasp that infects other parasitic wasps. A hyperparasite. These exist in real life. I was sad and depressed. I was in shock. Wait a minute, I infect other animals' children. If I care so much about children, why do I infect other animals' children? My whole worldview was shook up. I felt anxious and uncertain what to do. I can't go on being a parasite. Every time I look at a baby insect that I would normally infect, I think of my dead children. I can't go through with being a parasite anymore. I went off and thought about it a lot. I had parasite's guilt. I realize now that I was being a parasite for selfish reasons, so that I wouldn't have to look after my kids myself, and some random host animal would do that for me. I talked about humans being overexposed to eating animals, but I was brought up in a culture of parasites. I was the one overexposed to being a parasite. Parasite society has to change. I am old now, but I will teach the younger generation not to be parasites. That is my ultimate mission, my passion. Part 4, the finale. Wormsac, an antidepressant. Parasitic worms that hijack your brain and make you happier and more relaxed. Evolutionarily, the worm makes you less anxious of predators, so you avoid them less and the worm gets passed on to the predator. So the wormsac makes you less anxious because of this. And evolutionarily, the worm makes you more happy so that you take more risks and are more social and interact with more people, which passes on the worm. So wormsac makes you more happy as well because of this. The worms affect serotonin. It's nice to see parasitic worms in a more positive light. Helping people and being nice. Wormsac can even make you less angry and aggressive, evolutionarily, so that you wouldn't fight off predators, so that the worm parasite could get passed on to the predators. The worm said with a determined look. Previous generations of worms changed their evil parasitic ways as they lay dying on their deathbed. It was too late for them to do anything about that. I want to be good now, while I can make a difference. I don't want to regret my life. I don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past. Otherwise, we as worms have learnt nothing. As the worm finished, As human culture progresses, there is more equality for marginalised groups and minorities. There is better treatment of animals. There is more acceptance of other religions and cultures. Parasitic worm culture had progressed too. The values that the worms held had changed. They had become nicer to their hosts, making humans feel happier, made the parasitic worms happier. The humans and worms supported each other and lived happily ever after. I took my worm medication. Me and the worm were nicer and gentler together. Me and my parasitic worm were lovers.
One worm would challenge this happy paradigm, a worm with a head shaped like a battle axe. The worm tried to infect me. The worm spoke with a voice like pure hate. I only infect humans. Humans may say, what have worms ever done for them? But what have humans ever done for worms? Humans are the most destructive species on the planet. They're causing another mass extinction. Even parasites play a role in helping the ecosystem, but humans are the ones that think they're above the ecosystem and can just do whatever they want to nature. Humans are the real parasites of the earth. Humans have thought that they're God's chosen species, that even the sun revolves around them. They thought they're superior to even members of their own species, just because they're a different race. Humans only care about the environment when it affects humans. Moths aren't valued as much as butterflies, even in conservation, because they don't look as pretty. Would a human's only value come from how others perceive their looks? This is why I am happy to get my revenge on humans. Making humans suffer for their crimes fills me with joy. I am angry and hateful, and I want my vengeance. I don't infect other animals because humans are the only ones who really deserve it. This is for all the loving earthworms who've dried out and desiccated because of humans' paving stones. This is for all the earthworms that have been cut and split and stretched in two, just to see if the myth that both the head and tail end will survive. All the worms sprinkled with salt that sucks out their life force, impaled on a hook for fish to devour, all to fuel humans' unnecessary gluttony.
The parasite finished shouting and burrowed into my skin. Then I heard another voice. It was the other parasite, the good parasite, helping my mental health. They spoke with a serious demeanour. There's only room for one type of parasitic worm around these parts. The two factions of worms were locked in battle, each trying to save the viewpoints they represented. Our happily ever after had been challenged. The good worm said, Hurting and hating people isn't the right way to get through to people. It'll only push them further away. Tell people how together we can do better. Don't just tell people they're trash, or you won't get through to them. The bad parasite replied, If violence is so wrong, why are you shooting at me with a gun? You admit violence is acceptable under certain circumstances. The good worm replied, What else can I do? You're attacking me and my host. The bad worm interjected, Humans are attacking animals every day, but for some reason my violence isn't allowed. The good worm replied in submission, Fine, I'm putting down the gun. Do what you want with me. The battle axe worm tilted back its head, ready to swing at the good worm, but then they accidentally cut themselves in half with their own battle axe. Me and the happy worm had won. The happy worm thought, I guess violence just leads to more violence, and in the end, violence defeats itself. We would get our happily ever after in the end. Maybe the only thing worse than a parasite is a parasite apologist, but together we've got to have hope for building a better future for both humans and even parasites like wasps, who have their own important ecological role. Part 5, The Aftermath. thanks to parasites learning from the mistakes of the past, and thanks to worms donating their bodies to science, and thanks to parasites like wasps educating the next generation. Because of all this, parasites were able to do good and help humans' mental health. One thing remained, though. A worm body shape is incredibly common among many groups of animals. Worms have evolved independently many times. Lots of different types of parasites all have the same worm body shape because it helps with burrowing. It then seems likely that if aliens exist, then there are many alien worms out there. This intelligent alien had a parasitic alien worm in its eye. Worm society has triumphed on Earth, but each planet of worms has its own society and culture. Earth's parasites are now tasked with spreading the good word to the galaxy and teaching alien parasites how to be good. But is this okay? What about cultural relativism? Is morality subjective to each society of worms and their different values and perspectives? Or is there always one right way to act? Do we think our own culture is right just because we happen to be born into it? Parasites would have to grapple with these difficult questions in the years to come. Space, the final frontier. The humanoid aliens responded to our mission. They were disgruntled and not impressed. We aliens will not get rid of the parasites that occupy our bodies. Parasites are part of our alien ecosystem. They help out in their own way. On Earth, some Western cultures believe humans are separate and detached from nature, but us intelligent aliens believe we are just another organism, as humans are just another animal. Humans aren't the first organism to drastically transform the Earth, causing numerous extinctions. Even bacteria have drastically altered the environment billions of years ago when the oxygen they produced killed off most life forms on Earth. Humans are just another organism in the ecosystem, just like the bacteria. We aliens allow parasites to live out their ecological roles in our bodies and eyes because we are part of their same ecosystem. Yes, it hurts, and to an individualistic society like Western humans who value their own individual self, that would be bad. But we aliens are a collectivist society. We also value others' needs, like the parasites who can't live without a host. Humans have westernized cultures on their own planet. We will not let humans do the same to our culture. The alien finished. Earth's parasites were in shock. They had to take a step back. The Earthlings just replied with, I don't know what's right or wrong anymore. They had been so eager to convert the aliens, but now they didn't know what to do. And after they had worked so hard and put so much effort into changing Earth's own society. Warning, trypophobia. Part 6, crossover with rocks. Earth's parasites started being a parasite of the rock coal, because like animals, coal contains organic carbon, but rocks can't feel suffering, so infecting them is more ethical. Or so they thought. In the coming years, it was discovered that everything, including ordinary rocks, have some level of consciousness. And this is actually a real theory. Some parasites thought that if everything is conscious, parasites should just go back to eating animals instead of plants or rocks. Other parasites thought that even if rocks and plants are conscious, they still won't have the same level of consciousness or the same capacity to feel pain and suffering. The parasites also thought eating plants is still better for the environment than eating animals because it doesn't require an extra step in the food chain. Even rocks with eyes and arms and legs were presumed to just be stupid because they find moving and talking difficult. Eventually, ordinary rocks would be given robotic bodies so they could move and communicate. These rocks wanted to start a war with the worms because of the pain and suffering they'd inflicted by being parasites of rocks. The rock's hateful leader, however, was a piece of rock salt, and salt on the pavement dries out and kills earthworms. Both the rocks and worms were heading for war. Fear, tensions,
and hate rose high as impending doom drew ever closer.
Some rocks can be found inside holes in larger rocks. These rocks are themselves like parasites living in the larger rocks. The parasitic rocks felt anxiety and uncertainty. Whose side should they take in the war? The parasitic worms or the rocks? Would either side accept them? Their minds felt tugged and torn as they scrambled to decide which side to take. Even holes themselves are known as ontological parasites. Holes are always in or through something else and cannot be detached from their hosts. You can't have a hole without something the hole occupies or resides in. Holes created more surface area for objects like rocks to be worn away quicker. Holes really are parasites wearing away their hosts. In fact, the rocks declared war on holes themselves. The rocks filled in every hole they could. Holes are not empty, they contain gases from the air. Holes are conscious, and their life force grew smaller and smaller as they slowly got more and more filled in. The holes felt hopelessness and in despair as their end drew closer and closer. The parasitic holes made the rock's nose itch with illness. The hole's perspective was that rocks can live for millions of years, but holes can't live at all without rocks to infect. Surely that's not fair. My pet rock actually had a hole on the back of their head. They were harbouring a hole. They were in hiding. Even worse, they had made a baby with an earthworm. The hybrid baby's head is a rock with real tubes made by worms naturally attached. The baby wore a suit. The rock felt ashamed for having a worm baby and inferior for having a hole, but they knew they couldn't let their child be taken away. The hateful rock leader spoke. I can't go on anymore. We don't have the resources to fill in all the holes. My people depend on me. Rock's future depends on me. We're going to just have to round up all the rocks with holes in and destroy the rocks along with their holes. Rocks without holes are untainted by the parasites. They're superior. Even colour and edges are ontological parasites. Properties like colour and edges can't be separated from the objects that have these properties. Colour and edges can't exist in isolation. A shape has colour and edges, but edges and colours can't exist without a shape that the edges are a part of. Maybe I'm overthinking this. I'm just so stressed with everything. Parasites have destroyed rocks. Parasites started this. Rocks are the oppressed ones. Rocks are the victims. Rocks should be devoid of all parasites, including colour and edges. The master race of rocks should be uniform grey and round with no edges. Wait a minute, aren't curves parasites too? I don't know what to do. My anxiety is spiralling. After the rock leader finished talking, more and more of the rock zone people were being killed to get rid of parasites. There were dismembered rock feet that lay waste. The rock leader said, there's still parasites. Even shapes and form themselves are parasites. Rocks have to abandon shape and form themselves. We need to float as pure energy without form. Time passed still, and more parasites were killed. Eventually the rock leader looked at the ring with hate and disdain. The ring had a hole in it. They yelled, a parasite! Hang on, a ring can't exist without a hole to make it a ring. The ring itself is a parasite, living off the hole. Everything is a parasite. No matter what I do, there will always be parasites. I can't change that. You can't 100% get rid of parasites. There will always be a threat of parasites. Trying to get certainty that there are no parasites is only fueling my anxiety. Stop the war. No more harming parasites. The world rejoiced. A brighter future was ahead. The balloon people were out to celebrate. The hateful rock leader would learn to tolerate the uncertainty.
Why are holes conscious in my story? In real life, because of autism, I attribute human-like qualities and feelings to inanimate objects or animals like worms, insects, or mites.
With OCD, I feel anxiety where I worry I may accidentally harm tiny creatures. For example, I may worry that I could step on an insect. I don't want to harm tiny creatures like insects or mites because I don't want to cause them any pain or suffering. When I see rocks at the beach with lots of holes in them, I don't take the rocks home because there may be tiny creatures living inside the holes, especially creatures that made the holes in the first place. To me, holes and rocks are conscious because they may have tiny creatures living inside them. Someone gave me a rock with holes in, but I have not took it into the house yet because the creatures living in the holes may be happier outdoors in a more natural environment, but the person who gave me the rock had to take the rock out of their natural environment anyway. So the creatures that had lived in the rocks holes may die anyway. As well as worrying I might harm tiny creatures, I worry tiny creatures in the holes could also harm me. I want to take the rock into the house and clean it first so that any harmful insects don't take up residence in the house. But so far the rock is still in the garden because I don't want to harm the creatures by cleaning the rock. To me, holes are conscious, and my story reflects that. Months later, I've never took the rock inside the house. Holes in rocks may contain a bit of soil, and there could be lots of tiny living creatures in that soil. To me, soil is conscious because it contains tiny animals like mites or springtails, and I have empathy for soil. I also have empathy for holes, even holes like pockets or coat pockets that may have mites in them. I always check to make sure my pockets are zipped up so that an insect or mite does not crawl into my pocket and does not get trapped or suffocate or starve. Part about mites. Mites are tiny and round and therefore cute. Geckobia mites sit on a gecko's eyelid like little children sitting on a windowsill playing. They're like little red dots. The mites swing their legs and huddle together on the gecko's eye like a little cuddle pile. Tiny animals in people's pockets like kittens are cute. In real life, geckos can have pockets that tiny mites can live inside. These pockets are even smaller than people's pockets, with even tinier creatures living inside, and therefore even cuter. Mechos. Bikinis are one object even though they are made of two separate parts, a top and a bottom. In philosophy, what you class as one object is arbitrary. Geckos and their mites are two separate animals, but what if, like a bikini, you class the two parts as one thing, a mite gecko, a mecho? Just like how babies wrap their whole hand around their parent's finger, Geckobia might infect gecko's toes and wrap their whole body around the gecko's toe, not just the hand. The mites are therefore even cuter, and we have orange mites on the gecko foot. In real life, geckos can have folds of skin on their legs that may contain mites called mite pockets. In the fictional story, a tiny person made of mites that look like little red dots lives on the gecko's pocket. The mite person has borderline personality disorder. People with borderline personality disorder can fear abandonment or rejection and therefore want to be very close to another person. But they can also fear being too close to someone or being emotionally consumed by another person or emotionally engulfed by them. This leads people with borderline personality disorder to pull other people close, but also push them away, creating a push and pull dynamic. This means the person with borderline personality disorder wants to keep someone close, but not too close. The mites don't want to fuse and become one with the gecko, but they still want to be close and live in the gecko's mite pocket. Not too close, but not too distant. Of course, when the mites feel too close, they may push away and get up and walk out the gecko's mite pocket. To maintain a certain distance, they may then fear abandonment and impulsively hurry back into the gecko's pocket. The push and pull cycle repeats. The tiny person made of mites hated the idea that the geckos and their mites were one organism, a meko. They felt intense anger and terror at the thought of fusing with the gecko and becoming one organism, a meko. In real life, some mites group together around Gecko's eyes. In the fictional story, the person made of mites sits perched on the gecko's eyelids, swinging their legs. Why does the mite person always want to be in the gecko's field of view and be seen by the gecko? Does the mite person always want to be seen because they want attention, or do they just need validation? Here's how the mite person's borderline personality disorder causes them to be in the gecko's field of view. There is a lot of negative stigma and stereotypes about borderline personality disorder. For example, some people think people with BPD just want attention. However, humans are social creatures and everyone needs validation. Sometimes when people with BPD grow up, they do not receive enough validation or have their needs met. Some people with BPD maybe even be neglected. This means people with BPD may need validation because they did not receive enough growing up. People with BPD can grow up with extreme emotions, and these emotions can often be chronically invalidated growing up. People with BPD may also have trouble self-soothing or self-validating due to their upbringing. This means because people with BPD may need validations, criticism can be very hurtful to people with BPD, especially because people with BPD can fear rejection or abandonment. People with BPD can be very empathetic and sensitive. However, they can interpret neutral facial expressions as negative facial expressions. This means they can be more sensitive to criticism or rejection. That's why the mite person wants to be on the gecko's eyelid, in the gecko's field of view all the time and be seen by the gecko. It's because they need to be validated, and they get validation from the gecko watching them. The mite person was living on a gecko, but a separate gecko came along. The mite's gecko wanted to go out with this separate gecko. The mite person thought, I look bold and intense red. Mites look like little beads or gems or jewels. When the separate gecko sees me, they're going to fall in love with the gecko I live on. It's going to be just the three of us. I'm living on the gecko's eyes because my bright red colour is going to draw the separate gecko's gaze to the gecko I live on's beautiful eye. I just want the best for the gecko I live on. I want them to find another gecko mate and live happily ever after. But the separate gecko rejected the gecko I live on. Rejection really hurts me, and it makes me feel intense shame and guilt. I failed the gecko. It turned out having visible parasites makes the gecko look less fit and healthy and less of an ideal mate choice. I felt so much shame and guilt. I had to exile myself and hide myself. I lived in the gecko's mite pocket, where I was concealed, and the gecko's potential mates could not see me. After a while, though, the gecko said, Come back and live on my eye, where I can see you. If my gecko mate doesn't love me for who I am, and the mites I carry, then I don't need them. Part 7. Parasites in the media.
There is not much positive representation of parasites in the media. Parasites are often denied any humanity. Even in nature documentaries, there are not many worms. Mammals and birds make up a tiny proportion of all the species of animals out there, yet nature programs disproportionately feature birds and mammals. To top that off,
Quite a lot of nature documentaries are just about mammals, as if every other nature documentary wasn't nearly exclusively about mammals anyway. Worms need positive representation. Remakes of films are being made where the character is changed so that there is more diversity, or like Doctor Who being a woman, black or gay. Films will be remade to feature parasites in a more positive light. In The Lord of the Rings, a good parasitic worm infects the eye of Sauron. The parasite drains Sauron of their power, so that Sauron cannot return. This is the face-hugging parasite from the Alien films. The parasite says, "We love hugging and cuddling together." I wanted to show the parasite in a more positive light. There will also be books written about parasite equality. In real life, facultative parasites can complete their life cycle without a need for a host. In feminism, there is a saying that a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. In parasite culture, there is a saying that a parasite needs a host like they need a bicycle. Some parasites think they're a strong, independent parasite that don't need a host, and that parasites aren't part of their host body. They are their own worm. Trigger warning talks about suicide. Part 8, mental health. The parasite and their host lay in the same depressed position, hunched over with their head down, pointed at their knee. Here's why. Some parasites can't survive without a host. Parasites never asked to be born into a parasite's body. If they could choose, they wouldn't be a parasite. Their life path was predetermined before they even had the chance to decide whether to leave their egg. Are you someone who cares about morality? Someone who worries whether they're a good person? Do you worry what other people think of you? How would you feel if you were a parasite? Your esteem and ego would suffer. You'd feel insecure and anxious, worrying you're not a good person. You'd feel depressed about yourself. You'd feel guilty and awful for what you've done, and society would make you feel shameful, inferior, insignificant, and inadequate, like you don't get to have any humanity for what you've done. Some parasites can't survive without being parasites. What do you want them to do? You want parasites to feel so bad about themselves over something they can't change that they kill themselves? The voluntary parasite extinction movement are parasites who want to do just that because they feel the world would be a better place without them. Like how lab-grown meat is viewed as more ethical than killing a whole animal to eat, lab-grown organs were being produced so that parasites could infect an individual organ on its own without the need to harm a whole human. But what if cells have some level of consciousness? Organs are cells working together to form a tissue, and tissues working together to form an organ. The brain is just an organ. If the brain is conscious, why can't other organs be? The lab-grown organs felt pain and suffering, being bored, confined to a lab, and being infected with parasites. They had no quality of life, so they rose up and battled the parasites. The parasites had tried to do a good thing by infecting lab-grown organs. No matter what parasites do, they'll always have some negative effect on the world. Are humans any different? Every action humans do, no matter how simple, has some negative effect on the environment, even if it's just one human using a tiny bit of electricity. It's amplified 8 billion times because that's how many people are on the planet. Anytime parasites tried to do good, they felt like failures and worthless. They felt hopeless, like nothing could work. They could never truly be good. Suffice to say, the battle with the organs had a knock-on effect on their mental health. Some parasites are asexual. They couldn't just choose not to have kids. If parasites wanted to go extinct, they had to kill themselves. The parasites had all gathered ready to do it. They felt fear and worried whether they should go through with it. Then an earthworm that was a priest came to visit the depressed worm. I sewn a purplish cloak together and sewn a black and white priest collar on. I then sewn a golden cross and sewn a Bible on. The priest said, I know you feel bad being a parasite, like you're evil, but there can't be good without evil. Joy comes from gratitude, and gratitude comes from past suffering, because you're grateful for feeling better. I know society aims to reduce suffering. I'm not saying regressing to past times where there was more suffering is good. We should still strive for a better society, but eliminating all negative feelings and emotions would be bad too. Just be the best, nicest parasite you can, because no one is without sin. The priest finished. An alien with a worm in their eye appeared. They exclaimed, "Usually our culture does not impose itself on other planets. However, we must stop you from going through with this. Even parasites have a purpose in the ecosystem. You have a purpose. If all parasites went extinct, the ecosystem would collapse. Other animals would die as well, and new animals would just rush to fill all the parasites' ecological roles by becoming parasites themselves." The alien finished. The depressed worm shouted, "I'm not going to kill myself anymore." The depressed worm felt relieved. The depressed parasite said, "You're right. We should strive for a better society, and I do have a purpose. I still don't want to cause more suffering by bringing my parasite children into the world to cause more suffering. Asexual worms need something like a vasectomy that would stop them fertilizing themselves. I'm going to campaign for control over worms' own reproductive rights to strive for a society with less suffering. That is my purpose." Should some conservation effort go to saving parasites, or should we have just let the worm die? It's you, the public's choice. If you sponsor Parasites £5 a month, you get a free blue teddy bear with a fluffy blue tapeworm sewn onto its backside. I sewn on a face to the tapeworm as well. Bears can actually get giant tapeworms. But what if teddy bears are also conscious? How do they feel about parasites? Part 9. Planets. A living planet drifted by in space. The planet was made of flesh and blood with veins and craters. A ginormous parasitic worm hundreds of miles long poked out their nose. The planet, however, loved their parasite, for the planet drifted alone aimlessly in space. The planet was surrounded by the lifeless void of space. The parasite kept the planet company, reassuring it when the planet grew anxious and worried. The parasite held the planet's hand in a loving embrace. They may have been surrounded by apathetic darkness, but their love lighted up their hearts. Their future lay uncertain, shrouded in the darkness, but their parasite was a guiding light. Earth's parasites had taught the galaxy's worms to be just a bit nicer to their hosts. Their mission had been a success. The planet said to their worm caregiver,
"I'm scared of the dark, Daddy Worm, but when you tickle my nose it makes me feel better. Yahoo! Stop, achoo!"
With that, an asteroid made of flesh and blood flew out the planet's nose as they sneezed. It was heading straight for Earth. The asteroid reached Earth. Because of the living planet's giant size, the asteroid contained giant Ebola viruses. In real life, Ebola is worm-shaped and is covered in what's called glycoproteins, giving it a speckled appearance in real life. The giant Ebola viruses were the size of parasitic worms and infected humans crawling out their noses. Ebola caused an outbreak in real life, and these new Ebola viruses were ready to cause another outbreak. The viruses were just plain evil and wanted humans to bleed. In Ebola's mind, they're viruses. It's what they're supposed to do. World domination was on their mind. Earth's native parasites didn't want to help. Earth's native parasites felt anxious, insecure, and guilty. Being parasites themselves made them feel so bad about themselves. They felt they had caused the world enough harm already. They didn't want to add to that by hating the Ebola viruses, even if the viruses were evil. They felt they had to be morally perfect to compensate for their parasitic ways. They wouldn't harm anything else, no matter how evil the viruses were. Someone else will stop the viruses, the native worms thought. The aliens wouldn't help. They said, viruses coming from space is natural even before humans evolved. There were invasive species. In Earth's past, when North and South America became connected, numerous species travelled to and invaded the other continent. Are you saying if humans were alive in the past, they should have stopped that? Asteroids are natural and carry life as part of the galactic ecosystem. We will not help. No one had helped defeat the viruses. The human suffering continued until Earth's native worms finally felt they needed to step in. They battled the viruses until the native parasites finally became triumphant. The world rejoiced and they all felt happy and relieved. The worms gave their victory speech. They said, parasitic worms are not perfect, but no one can ever be perfect. As parasitic worms, we now accept ourselves as fallible beings like everybody else. We don't need to be perfect. Striving for perfection has only made us miserable. Part 10. Not suitable for children. Parasitic worms babbled amongst themselves. I still feel so bad about infecting people and causing them suffering. I hate that to survive I have to clog people's airways, effectively choking them and making them feel pain. If only there was some way to make this more ethical. I know. Why don't we only infect people who like feeling pain and like being choked? Ooh, I don't know about that. As a utilitarian worm, I want to maximize happiness and pleasure and minimize pain and suffering. Wouldn't we still be causing pain? Ah, but remember, the people we're infecting like pain. It's pleasurable to them. What happens between a consenting adult parasite and their adult host is none of anyone else's business. Well, that's settled then. Let's do it. Let's make the world a better place. The man whose face was blue from being choked spoke.
Personally, worms aren't my thing, but I still quite like pain and being choked. I thought if I let the worms infect me, then they wouldn't be infecting someone else who doesn't like pain. I find it hard to understand how wilders don't like pain, but it's not about what I like or dislike. It's about them. That's why I let worms infect me, even though I'm not into worms, and it's bad for my body.
Well, isn't that wholesome? In the film Jurassic World, dinosaurs are brought back, and a dinosaur is genetically modified to be a really aggressive killing machine. This dinosaur is called Indominus Rex and tries to kill everyone. Here is a version of the movie where the dinosaur's parasitic worms are also genetically modified to be the ultimate parasite. The Indominus worm. The Indominus Rex dinosaur said,
if someone who is psychotic harms someone, they can have diminished responsibility. It's not as much their fault because of how their brain works. If someone with epilepsy has a seizure and crashes their car into someone, it's not their fault because their brain is different. Indominus Rex was created to be the biggest killer. My brain was made to be different through modifying my genes. My actions are justifiable because my brain is different. Is it dog breed's fault for harming people, even though their nature was predetermined before they were even born, through hundreds of years of selective breeding? My killing and aggression is not my fault. Everyone's brain is slightly different, and so no one is really responsible for anything. Our actions are already predetermined by our biology and our environment. Free will doesn't exist. I'm justified to do whatever I want. I will kill all the humans in the park.
The parasite Indominus worm responded. I've not believed in free will for a long time, but it's dinosaurs and people like you that have finally made me realise why it's so important we say something explains your actions but doesn't excuse it. Maybe someone has as much control over their actions as a virus has control over its actions, but we always try to prevent viruses and cure them. Maybe no one deserves to suffer because they're a bad person just for the sake of suffering, but doesn't mean they don't need to be punished to prevent further crime and suffering. That's why I'm here, because you're a virus, and I'm here to prevent you. With that, the parasite entered the dinosaur's body. Parasites can alter their host's brain, and the parasite made the dinosaur nicer and less aggressive. The humans were saved. The dinosaur said to the parasite,
Thank you. Part of me always wanted to be good, but I just needed your help to make that a reality.
if you feel like the dinosaur used to feel, please reach out for help. When other parasitic worms watched this version of the film, it made them think that things explain why they're a parasite, but does it excuse being a parasite? Part 11, Earthworms. Before I became really interested in parasites, I was really interested in earthworms, which are not parasites. This has shaped my perspective of parasites. Here are my actual thoughts about earthworms in real life. I love earthworms. I was feeling down and depressed, so I just imagined a big earthworm I could give a hug to. And giant earthworms exist in real life. You can get this earthworm that's over 1 meter long, and it can be a really nice blue colour, like a Prussian blue. And so I'd love to just have one of these to cuddle this giant earthworm. And so I drew this giant blue earthworm. I drew it life-sized, so now I can cuddle it. Baby worm, Wormy Jr. I love seeing cute earthworms going about their little worm business. I think this is a baby worm and I love its little pink squidgy head, assuming that's the head. Here's a baby worm all curled up like a human in the fetal position. I love that worms are all squidgy. Here's a baby worm in their cot. The worm is wearing a gender-neutral green hat because earthworms are non-binary and have both types of reproductive organs. Worms are very vulnerable. Worms are blind and deaf but can sense vibrations in the ground. The worm has sunglasses, a hearing aid, and a stick. There should be tactile bumps on the edge of pavements so that worms don't wander onto the pavements and dry out on it. I feel emotionally vulnerable, like worms. Earthworms are very loving, helping out the soil and ecosystem. Worms have no defences and are completely harmless. They're peaceful. I feel peaceful and loving towards earthworms as well. I feel connected to earthworms. Of course, go back in time to the savage Neanderthal worms, and worms were less gentle and nice. They had a protruding brow ridge, a big nose, and a protruding upper jaw like Neanderthals. They had spears and wore bee fur. I obsessively worry if I reduce my tablets, I'll revert back and become less nice and gentle. With autism, you can notice small details. I noticed this tiny earthworm when walking. With OCD, you can scan the ground looking for worms to rescue so they don't dry out. I feel small, insignificant, submissive or inferior when viewing myself, like the worms on the pavement that are dependent or helpless. I can't quite put my finger on it. I couldn't quite put my finger on the worm either, though. I tried to scoop up the worm with my long nail, but I gave up after a while, thinking if I tried too hard, I may damage the fragile worm. I feel inadequate.
I couldn't save them. Some worms you just can't save. In real life, go back far enough, and animals like humans, insects, earthworms, and octopuses all had a common ancestor that was a worm. My ancestor was actually a worm. I'm part worm. I feel amazed, happy, and connected to worms. My great-great-great-great-great-great-great-granddad was a worm. Back then, they didn't have coloured photos, but you can see the resemblance. They lived hundreds of millions of years ago, so they're David the First, whereas I'm David the 10 millionth. So why do I feel so much like a worm? I feel like a worm because I'm part worm. It's in my genes and heritage.
I drew an earthworm playing with toys like a dinosaur, an astronaut, a panda, a car, and a soldier. I look at earthworms like I would a dog, or like someone else might look at a small child. Earthworms are just cute, and I feel like I want to care for them and show them affection. I feel the same about my other interests, like round, cute, fluffy lumps of moss, or my pet rock around pebbles. I feel lovingly towards them. Like they're people. Humans find animals that look like human babies cute. Insect babies can be worm-shaped like caterpillars. If insects found their babies cute, they may also find worm-shaped things in general cute. The aliens also have babies that are worm-shaped, and so they think of parasitic worms like babies, even though their actual worm-shaped babies are not parasitic. Human babies live inside mothers like they're parasites and make them sick in the morning, like in morning sickness, influence their mood and brain like a parasite, and feel really painful during labour like a parasite that causes pain. Yet we humans think of babies very different to parasites. Because parasites invoke a cute response in the aliens with parasitic worms in their eyes think of the parasites more like a human with a cute baby growing in their belly. They feel sympathy for the parasites, like they're vulnerable and helpless without their hosts, like they're innocent and can do no wrong. Maybe that's why they allow parasites in their eyes in the first place. Maybe I, the narrator, am also one of the aliens. I feel like an alien. In real life, hundreds of millions of years ago, humans' ancestors were worms, so I'm part worm. Maybe in the past an alien interbred with one of my human ancestors, and so I'm also part alien. I feel isolated, disconnected, and alienated, like I'm an alien. I have very different interests to others, like worms and the plant moss. When I extensively research mental illness, I can't find others with similar issues or similar OCD themes. I can't find anyone who makes similar YouTube videos. I feel very weird and different even among other autistic people, and anxious and obsessive to figure myself out. Part 12, Earthworms 2. This next video is from about a year before I became interested in parasites, and it shows what led to me becoming interested in parasites. I hand sew outfits for real worms to wear. How did my autism and OCD affect this? Autistic people can personify things and feel empathy for things that aren't humans, like insects or inanimate objects. When I see worms on the pavement, I pick them up and put them on the grass. This is so they don't dry out or get stepped on. My OCD causes distressing emotions and compulsions, like going a bit over the top with picking up worms. For example, if on occasions it's been raining and I see at least 20 worms, I have to pick everyone up. If I see worms that are clearly dead, the OCD would make me think, maybe the worms aren't dead. I may think worms are simple animals, and simple creatures can recover and regenerate from a lot of things. Once I thought I saw a worm and didn't pick it up. After walking quite a lot further, I felt anxiety and had to walk all the way back to find the worm. While walking in general, I used to look down and scan every twig for a worm. Later on, my OCD got a lot better, and I developed a special interest in earthworms, and I made outfits for them. I still had rules though when making the outfits. For example, if I picked worms up off the grass, it may cause the worms unnecessary stress being handled. I therefore only use worms on the pavement because I have to handle them anyway to rescue them. I also would spend time researching things to an extreme degree, like is felt safe for worms. I would only use nearby worms, and then after putting them in outfits for about a minute, I would put them back outside on the grass nearby. Autistic people can also be more interested in objects than people, although with some autistic people this isn't always the case. Autistic people can also prefer anthropomorphized characters to people, and so I also have stories with the worms in outfits as characters. When I made the heart defibrillator for a worm, it was to examine how I and other people treat and value worms compared to how we treat humans and other animals. Worms can have 10 heart-like structures called aortic arches, and so there are 10 pads on the defibrillator, one for each aortic arch. My OCD to do with creatures like worms and insects is a lot better now, and now I only pick up worms that look alive. Basically, I have a deep connection to the worms. I even got the word worms tattooed across my face. That's a joke, but this video is sort of actually dedicated to all the worms and is in loving memory of all the worms that were already dead before I could save them. I'll just light a candle. And for all the worms out there that are pink to make the boys wink, here's a wink. Part 13. Conservation.
Esteemed members of our society, I implore your attention. So how do I feel about parasite conservation? I feel a bit apprehensive to say we should help parasites because I don't want to cause the animals they infect pain and suffering. However, the question is, are parasites so important for the ecosystem and environment that not helping parasites actually causes other animals more suffering? It's a lesser of two evils issue. Conserving parasites doesn't mean we should allow the parasites to infect humans, and parasites may actually have a really positive impact on medicine. Parasites can affect organisms' brains, and the rabies virus understands humans' own dopamine system better than humans do themselves. We could treat illnesses by infecting people with modified versions of a relatively harmless parasite called Toxoplasma gondii that already infects a large proportion of humans without them even knowing. So parasites could probably still help medicine without people needing to actually be infected by the parasites themselves. Maybe we should send people who sponsor parasites teddies with fluffy toy parasites sewn to their backsides, as if they're parasites coming out of them. The conscious teddies are having a teddy bear's picnic. Whatever the teddies eat, their parasites also eat, so really, it's a parasite's picnic. I was only allowed to actually sew a dressing gown cord to the blue teddy. I hope by making this video, I've changed your perception of parasites. Not much funding goes into parasite conservation, so maybe together we should change that. Parasites which infect multiple hosts during their lifetime are really at risk to climate change because if anything happens to any one of their hosts, it could impact the parasites. Time is running out. There are so many parasites at risk of becoming extinct that we just don't know how the ecosystem will cope. Section B. So far we've discussed biological parasites like parasitic worms and parasitic mites.
However, there is also a concept in philosophy called ontological parasites, which is different from biological parasites. So this next part is not about biological parasites, it's about philosophical parasites. Earth's parasites started being a parasite of the rock coal because, like animals, coal contains organic carbon, but rocks can't feel suffering, so infecting them is more ethical. Or so they thought. In the coming years, it was discovered that everything, including ordinary rocks, have some level of consciousness. And this is actually a real theory. Some parasites thought that if everything is conscious, parasites should just go back to eating animals instead of plants or rocks. Other parasites thought that even if rocks and plants are conscious, they still won't have the same level of consciousness or the same capacity to feel pain and suffering. The parasites also thought eating plants is still better for the environment than eating animals because it doesn't require an extra step in the food chain. Even rocks with eyes and arms and legs were presumed to just be stupid because they find moving and talking difficult. Eventually, ordinary rocks would be given robotic bodies so they could move and communicate. These rocks wanted to start a war with the worms because of the pain and suffering they'd inflicted by being parasites of rocks. The rock's hateful leader, however, was a piece of rock salt, and salt on the pavement dries out and kills earthworms. Both the rocks and worms were heading for war. Fear, tensions, and hate rose high as impending doom drew ever closer. Some rocks can be found inside holes in larger rocks. These rocks are themselves like parasites living in the larger rocks. The parasitic rocks felt anxiety and uncertainty. Whose side should they take in the war? The parasitic worms or the rocks? Would either side accept them? Their minds felt tugged and torn as they scrambled to decide which side to take. Even holes themselves are known as ontological parasites. Holes are always in or through something else and cannot be detached from their hosts. You can't have a hole without something the hole occupies or resides in. Holes created more surface area for objects like rocks to be worn away quicker. Holes really are parasites wearing away their hosts. In fact, the rocks declared war on holes themselves. The rocks filled in every hole they could. Holes are not empty, they contain gases from the air. Holes are conscious, and their life force grew smaller and smaller as they slowly got more and more filled in. The holes felt hopelessness and in despair as their end drew closer and closer. The parasitic holes made the rock's nose itch with illness. The hole's perspective was that rocks can live for millions of years, but holes can't live at all without rocks to infect. Surely that's not fair. My pet rock actually had a hole on the back of their head. They were harbouring a hole. They were in hiding. Even worse, they had made a baby with an earthworm. The hybrid baby's head is a rock with real tubes made by worms naturally attached. The baby wore a suit. The rock felt ashamed for having a worm baby and inferior for having a hole, but they knew they couldn't let their child be taken away. The hateful rock leader spoke. I can't go on anymore. We don't have the resources to fill in all the holes. My people depend on me. Rock's future depends on me. We're going to just have to round up all the rocks with holes in and destroy the rocks along with their holes. Rocks without holes are untainted by the parasites. They're superior. Even colour and edges are ontological parasites. Properties like colour and edges can't be separated from the objects that have these properties. Colour and edges can't exist in isolation. A shape has colour and edges, but edges and colours can't exist without a shape that the edges are a part of. Maybe I'm overthinking this. I'm just so stressed with everything. Parasites have destroyed rocks. Parasites started this. Rocks are the oppressed ones. Rocks are the victims. Rocks should be devoid of all parasites, including colour and edges. The master race of rocks should be uniform grey and round with no edges. Wait a minute, aren't caves parasites too? I don't know what to do. My anxiety is spiraling. After the rock leader finished talking, more and more of the rock zone people were being killed to get rid of parasites. There were dismembered rock feet that lay waste. The rock leader said, "There's still parasites. Even shapes and form themselves are parasites. Rocks have to abandon shape and form themselves. We need to float as pure energy without form." Time passed still, and more parasites were killed. Eventually the rock leader looked at the ring with hate and disdain. The ring had a hole in it. They yelled, "A parasite! Hang on, a ring can't exist without a hole to make it a ring. The ring itself is a parasite, living off the hole. Everything is a parasite. No matter what I do, there will always be parasites. I can't change that. You can't 100% get rid of parasites. There will always be a threat of parasites. Trying to get certainty that there are no parasites is only fueling my anxiety. Stop the war. No more harming parasites." The world rejoiced. A brighter future was ahead. The balloon people were out to celebrate. The hateful rock leader would learn to tolerate the uncertainty.
Why are holes conscious in my story? In real life, because of autism, I attribute human-like qualities and feelings to inanimate objects or animals like worms, insects, or mites. With OCD, I feel anxiety where I worry I may accidentally harm tiny creatures. For example, I may worry that I could step on an insect. I don't want to harm tiny creatures like insects or mites because I don't want to cause them any pain or suffering. When I see rocks at the beach with lots of holes in them, I don't take the rocks home because there may be tiny creatures living inside the holes, especially creatures that made the holes in the first place. To me, holes in rocks are conscious because they may have tiny creatures living inside them. Someone gave me a rock with holes in, but I have not took it into the house yet because the creatures living in the holes may be happier outdoors in a more natural environment, but the person who gave me the rock had to take the rock out of their natural environment anyway. So the creatures that had lived in the rocks holes may die anyway. As well as worrying I might harm tiny creatures, I worry tiny creatures in the holes could also harm me. I want to take the rock into the house and clean it first, so that any harmful insects don't take up residence in the house. But so far the rock is still in the garden, because I don't want to harm the creatures by cleaning the rock. To me, holes are conscious, and my story reflects that. Months later, I've never took the rock inside the house. Holes in rocks may contain a bit of soil, and there could be lots of tiny living creatures in that soil. To me, soil is conscious because it contains tiny animals like mites or springtails, and I have empathy for soil. I also have empathy for holes, even holes like pockets or coat pockets that may have mites in them. I always check to make sure my pockets are zipped up so that an insect or mite does not crawl into my pocket and does not get trapped or suffocate or starve.
Part 2.
As well as worrying about harming earthworms, I worry about harming earthworms' burrows, as if their burrow holes are conscious. I never dig, because it might either harm worms or harm tiny creatures in the soil, but it may destroy worms' homes, their burrows. The earthworms may need to build new burrows. That must be such a hassle to earthworms, where they need to survive on top of worrying about making a new burrow. They need a burrow to take refuge from predators and to take refuge from the scorching sun drying them to a frazzle. Other worms may not let them share a burrow. They will be turned away. Where will they lay their eggs? If worms
could feel complex emotions. They'd feel rejected and hurt by other worms, not letting them share a burrow. They'd feel isolated, stranded by themselves, with nowhere to go. Earthworms are nearly blind. They would not know what was happening to them, frantically scrambling around trying to get their bearings. It would be almost impossible, and they'd feel insecure and inadequate with their attempt. They'd feel fear, scared, and terror as the sun beats down on them, illuminating their presence and making them feel paranoid about everything watching them. They'd feel so insignificant compared to all the predators watching them, which are much bigger. They'd feel confused by what was going on, startled by the shovel suddenly carving away their home and livelihood. Where would they bring their leaves now? They would not be able to provide for themselves. When rescuing worms, I always try and put them as close to where I found them as possible. Burrow holes can't exist without soil to be a part of. Burrow holes can't exist without living inside soil. If there was no soil, there would be no burrow holes. Parasites can't survive without a host, and burrow holes can't exist without soil to be embedded within. Burrows are ontological parasites, but burrows care for earthworms. Earthworms depend on burrows, and burrows aerate soil so all other organisms in the soil can breathe. Burrows may be ontological parasites, but burrows are nice and loving, giving worms stability and security in an ever-changing world that is even more unpredictable because worms are blind and have not evolved to live in human habitats. Thank you, burrows. I guess parasites, even ontological parasites like burrows, are nice and loving. Burrows would feel proud and fulfilled that they're helping worms and that their life has meaning and purpose because of it. It brings them great joy and peace. They'd feel connected and accepted with their worm friend they provide a home to. Giant earthworms exist in real life. Here's me hugging a giant earthworm, and here's the shadow of me hugging a giant earthworm. Shadows may be ontological parasites. If there was no light, there could be no shadow. Shadows can only exist in reference to light. Shadows are always embedded within an otherwise illuminated area. Shadows live inside their light hosts, and shadows can't survive without light. When it's dark and I'm walking, I used to have to shine the torch on my phone everywhere I went. It was light enough to see where I was going, but dark enough that I might accidentally step on a tiny creature. I once accidentally stepped on a snail when it was dark. I felt so guilty because when you step on a snail, you can hear a crunch and its body is smashed into pieces. It's so graphic and visceral. Snails are also larger than mice and insects, and we humans may be biased towards larger animals, where we care more about hating larger animals. Now I no longer use a torch at night. The streetlight illuminates some of the street, but things like cars and myself cast shadows. It's too dark to see tiny creatures in the shadows. I feel empathy for the shadows. I don't want to step on the shadow, or I might step on tiny creatures without realizing. If there's a shadow, I have to walk around it, or if it's not possible to walk around the shadow, I have to take a huge long step over the shadow. I have to scan the shadows even more intently to try and see if there's any tiny creatures in them. Shadows themselves are ontological parasites, and these parasites are conscious because tiny creatures live in them. I don't want to step on and hurt shadows. I also worry about stepping on shadows because there may be dog poo in shadows. I may accidentally kill more tiny creatures because of shadows, but shadows are just trying to help the tiny creatures. Streetlights illuminate the area for any predator to see the tiny creatures. The streets are not supposed to have this much light pollution. It's night. Animals need to go about their business under the cover of darkness just to survive. The tiny creatures need to hide in the shadows, outside of the blinding and blaring light exposing their whereabouts to everything. Shadows are nice. They're just trying to help conceal the tiny creatures. They don't know that them concealing the tiny creatures is precisely why I step on the tiny creatures. Shadows are not used to people constantly checking the ground so they don't harm anything. How would shadows anticipate that? Shadows care for tiny creatures, and if they knew they'd caused tiny creatures to die, the shadows would feel so guilty and upset and sad. They'd failed the tiny creatures. The shadows would feel inadequate about their failure, and insecure and less confident in themselves and their ability. The shadows would feel worthless, and their whole being revolves around protecting tiny creatures. Even in the day when it's too hot, shadows protect tiny creatures, keeping them out of the scorching sun. If shadows could not help the tiny creatures, then the shadows would feel worthless. All their efforts would have failed. What would other different shadows think of them? Would the different shadows judge them and inflict shame upon them? The shadow had done its best to save the tiny creatures. The shadow had all the best intentions. They were a good ontological parasite at heart. Before I talk about this drawing, I want to be clear that if you watch my other videos, this part of the story makes a lot of sense, and I am not gaining anything inappropriate from this drawing. It's completely innocent. Okay, so in real life, I am on an antipsychotic that has raised my levels of a hormone called prolactin. And high prolactin can cause even men to develop boobs in real life. So what if in a parallel universe, I developed boobs? Just like holes are ontological parasites, so are gaps. You can't have gaps without something for a gap to be between. The gap between my boobs is an ontological parasite. An insect or mite could find its way between the gap in my boobs. What if my boobs swing into each other and the insect or mite get squished between the two boobs? The gap person tried to push the boobs apart at all costs. They felt the responsibility of saving the tiny creatures caught in the crossfire. The gap felt the weight of responsibility pushing down on them as they kept pushing the boobs apart. The tiny creatures depended on the gap person. The gap felt exhausted and overwhelmed from constantly having to keep the boobs apart. It felt unfair that they alone must carry this burden. This made them feel angry with them. They had to do this constantly. Their job had gone on for so long without a break. They were so frustrated. They just wanted a break. They were so overwhelmed that they felt more irritated. They couldn't fail though, otherwise they'd feel inadequate. They had to keep pushing the boobs apart, otherwise the boobs would bang into each other and squish the tiny creatures. Part 3. Knots themselves may be ontological parasites. Knots live on things like strings, but knots cannot exist outside of objects like strings. You can't have a knot without a string host for a knot to reside on. So knots themselves are parasites because their existence is dependent on strings. In my story about parasitic worms are nice and get a vasectomy or their tubes tied so that they can't reproduce. The worm's reproductive tubes were tied in a knot. Worms may be parasites, but aside from that, knots themselves are ontological parasites, as well as worms being parasites. So this story is talking about two different kinds of parasites. Parasites as in worms, but also parasites is in ontological parasites, which is a concept in philosophy, and knots are a type of ontological parasite. The knot that tied the worm's reproductive tubes didn't want to bring any more parasitic worms into the world. The knot person wanted to stop the worms from reproducing. They thought that parasitic worms already alive are just trying to survive. They would not kill the already living parasitic worms. That seemed immoral. But the knots wanted to prevent any future parasitic worms from being born. The knots wanted to reduce suffering, and that's how they were going to do it. They felt hate and injustice towards parasitic worms. They feared the harm the worms could cause. They were revolted and repulsed by the damage caused to the worm's host. They felt anger and unfairness and injustice at the worms for all the suffering they inflict on their hosts. The knots thought it was their duty, their responsibility, their purpose to tie the worm's reproductive tubes in a knot so that the worm could not reproduce. They felt proud, courageous, and powerful as they prevented future suffering. But they were motivated by hate for parasitic worms. Worms can poo out worm casts that look like squiggly lines. Lugworms that live at the beach are not parasitic worms. Despite this, lugworms live in sand burrows, which are holes in the ground. If you remember, holes, and therefore burrows, are ontological parasites because burrows can't exist independently of the ground the hole is embedded in. So lugworms are not biological parasites, but their burrows in the sand are ontological parasites in philosophical terms. With my OCD, I worry about disturbing worm burrows, as the burrows are the worms' homes. This means when I'm at the beach, if I see worm poo, I know a worm's burrow is close by. I therefore avoid walking near lugworm poo, not because I worry about being contaminated, but because I worry I might harm the worm's burrow. I feel empathy for the lugworm's burrows, because if I step near lugworm burrows, I may compress the sand and therefore damage the worm's burrow. The lugworm needs their burrows. It's like their house. It's their way of life. I feel empathy for the worm burrows because I don't want to inconvenience the worm living inside. I don't want the lugworm to have to build a whole new burrow. I don't want the worm to get squished as the sand above it gets compressed. So here's what the burrow itself would feel. So this is the burrow's perspective if the burrow was conscious. The burrow itself would feel fragile and delicate, as if it had no control over the world. Anything moving around the burrow could collapse the burrow. The world felt unpredictable and uncertain to the burrow. It was like walking on eggshells for the burrow. The burrow felt in constant fear of itself collapsing. It felt on edge. It couldn't relax. It could collapse at any time. The burrow had to look after the worm, but constantly worrying about the worm drained the burrow. The burrow felt exhausted from constantly anticipating threats and being hyper-vigilant to the threats. The burrow felt shame and guilt. If they collapsed, the worm would be inconvenienced, and the burrow would be responsible. The burrow felt they were a bad burrow if they failed the worm. They would feel inadequate as well as shame and guilt. The burrow would feel submissive as they tried to appease their surroundings as they walked on eggshells. They just went along with the environment. They remained still as they could, frozen in a fear response. If the burrows stayed still, the ground surrounding them could not shift or collapse. They analysed the smallest sand grain for any movement. The burrow felt despair and powerless as it could not move. The burrow felt vulnerable to any movement of the sand. I have made a story about parasitic worms and parasitic mites, but as well as biological parasites, there are philosophical parasites called ontological parasites. Holes in trousers and grass stains in trousers are ontological parasites. This is because holes and stains can't exist without something to be embedded in or on. If there were no trousers, the hole and grass stain could not exist. The hole and stain are dependent on their trouser host for survival. I thought my occupational therapist's bright yellow trousers were a unique and quirky colour. The trousers may end up in the soil, where earthworms may eat the plant fibres in the trousers. The sun may bleach the yellow trousers, making them white. The hole in the trousers was conscious, and the grass stain in the trousers was also conscious. The hole's perspective was that they were benefiting the ecosystem by getting bigger. The bigger the hole got, the more the trousers broke down. They thought trousers are not a natural part of the environment. The hole thought by becoming bigger, they were restoring balance to the ecosystem. The trousers as a whole were also conscious as well as the hole and stain that parasitized the trousers.
The hole was harming the trousers as it expanded. The hole thought, trousers are man-made and they're invasive to the natural environment. Harming the trousers was morally justified. The hole was motivated by hate, though. They just wanted to harm the trousers. Trousers were part of the human world, not the natural world. The hole did not like immigrants, and the trousers had emigrated to the natural environment from the human environment. The grass stain, on the other hand, had been created by cutting the grass. They had been born out of trauma to the grass. Humans had harmed the grass by cutting it. Trousers were human-made, and to the grass stain, everything human was bad. The grass stain thought, humans cut me up. I hate humans and their trousers. I'm going to destroy trousers as much as I can. They deserve it. That's why the hole and stain justified parasitizing the trousers. They were driven by hate, but the stain and hole also felt connected to each other and a sense of community among the parasites. They felt camaraderie and belonging with the other parasites and part of something bigger than themselves. They even felt love and cared for the other parasites. They felt purpose and they felt joy and peace from connecting with the other parasites on the trousers. They felt less isolated and wanted to help other parasites. They were motivated by both positive and negative emotions, like both love for each other and hate for humans and trousers. I should clarify, though, that I am not against immigrants, so that part of the story does not reflect me. Part 4. Previously a hateful piece of rock salt tried to wipe out all biological parasites like parasitic worms, but also all ontological parasites like holes. The rock salt had become good. They would cry with guilt at what they had done. They dissolved in their own tears and became the salt and soil. They turned into a big pile of white salt. They had changed from Salt the Orange to Salt the White, like Gandalf. They joined the Soil Avengers and would mix in with everything else in the soil. My therapist's trousers are also in the Soil Avengers. The pair of trousers was conscious and said to the salt,
I am an occupational therapist. I can't give you psychological therapy. However, I can help you fill your day with more things to do. I think your problem is you're not occupied enough, and so when you have too much time, you get bored and your mind starts to drift, and you start getting preoccupied with thoughts about wiping out humans or worms. You can fill your day with things that make you feel enjoyment, achievement, and connected to others. And that way you won't have too much time on your hand and you won't start obsessing about genocide while feeling negative emotions. Previously, you've just ended up going round and round in circles with your thoughts, and this is called rumination. Filling your day with more meaningful activities is known as behavioral activation, and that's what I'm going to offer you.
The salt said,
Thank you. I want to change now.
In biology, genes replicate and mutate, and some mutations can replicate more. Memetics is about ideas, not biology. In memetics, though, ideas have been hypothesized to spread like genes, where ideas get copied and altered, and some alterations of ideas spread more and are more successful. This is like in biology, where some mutations or alterations of genes are more successful. Just like how humans can be hosts to viruses, in memetics humans can be hosts to ideas, and humans can spread ideas. If humans are hosts to ideas, does that mean ideas can infect humans like parasites? These ideas are called memetic parasites, so there's biological parasites, philosophical parasites called ontological parasites, but there's also cultural parasites like memetic parasites. The cultural idea of luxmaxing may be a memetic parasite. The parasite that was the concept of luxmaxing had a chiseled jaw and was very muscly but also squidgy like an amoeba. People infected by luxmaxing call each other subhuman, literally dehumanizing other people infected, and told each other if they don't look good, they have no value or self-worth and no one will care about them. They'll be at the bottom of the hierarchy. The looks-maxing parasite spoke. I exploit people's insecurities and inadequacies because these feelings motivate my hosts to become better versions of themselves. If they didn't feel that insecure or inadequate, they would not achieve what they do. By catching them in a loop of feeling insecure and inadequate, I keep them always striving for looking perfect. But perfection is valued by society. It's a positive trait in society. Sure, they'll never reach perfection, but with every attempt, my hosts will get better and better. Even if the goalposts keep changing, my hosts will keep improving. I, the looks-maxing parasite, just want my human host to do well and achieve in life. I value achievement and I want the best for my hosts. Maybe my hosts will be less happy than if they did not obsess as much about their appearance, but improving their appearance and achieving gives them meaning in life. You can't have a life of both meaning and happiness. If you want a life of true happiness, you always live in the present. But if you want a life of true meaning, you live in the past and future. I choose a life of meaning for my human hosts, even if it makes them less happy. I don't know, maybe I, the looks-maxing parasite, feel guilty deep down, and I make myself feel better by finding an excuse to justify being a parasite. Maybe I have cognitive dissonance. Maybe I should not be a parasite altogether, instead of just finding an excuse to help me sleep at night. The looks-maxing parasite continued talking. If you're horrible to yourself, but really nice to other people, everyone loves you and thinks you're great. But if you're really nice to yourself and horrible to another person, everyone hates you and thinks you're terrible. There are two people, yourself and another person, and in both circumstances, you're being nice to one person and not nice to another person. You're a human too. Why can't you have as much compassion for yourself than for other people? Me being horrible to my host is fine because I'm nice to myself. How is that any different from being horrible to yourself and nice to others? Do you not believe the self matters as well? I give my host hardship, but hardship leads to striving, and striving leads to greatness. I want my host to be great. Great hosts are forged in fire. It is my job, the parasite, to light the flame. Suffering leads to a desire to change things and ambition. That's why I keep my hosts in a loop of eternal insecurity, inadequacy, perfectionism, and feelings of inferiority. I need to help my host achieve, and if I don't help myself first and practice self-compassion, how can I then go on to help people achieve their dreams? If you can't help yourself, how can you help anyone else? Looks-maxing is part of the manosphere, but there's Earth's other spheres, like the biosphere or geosphere. Ped means feet or walking. You walk on soil, and so the actual name for the soil sphere is the pedosphere. The worm burrows teamed up with other soil creatures like the decomposing therapist's trousers, the trousers hole and grass stain, and with the salt that had become part of the soil. Together the pedosphere took on the manosphere. The salt had given up harming parasites. They spoke. I stopped hurting parasites because no matter how hard you try, you can never 100% get rid of parasites. There is always some uncertainty. I should not try and wipe out all parasites on the earth. With diseases, you can't 100% prevent getting infected by every disease, and constantly, excessively and compulsively preventing getting ill will only make you mentally suffer more, despite it not being worth preventing all diseases or parasites. There are some diseases and situations where things like hand washing are necessary. When I tried to wipe out all parasites on Earth, that was foolish. But there are some parasites that still need to be dealt with, like luxmaxing. Luxmaxing is part of the manosphere. The salt finished speaking. The soil pedosphere took on the manosphere in battle. The salt fought side by side with the soil parasites, like the burrow holes and hole and stain in the therapist's trousers. The salt said, "Never thought I'd die fighting side by side with parasites." The parasite replied, "What about fighting side by side with friends?" The salt replied, "Yes, I could do that." The pedosphere won. The soil had beat the manosphere.